you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony today?
I affirm.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you. Peace and blessings to everyone. And I just want to say thank you to this entire panel, A.G. James, A.G. Lynch, Professor Friedman, for your many years of work on this issue. I've been out. I can't remember if the protest started on the 28th or the 29th, but I was out, I believe, one of those days for a good week or two after that. And first of all, the most interesting thing was this was a protest about too much policing, over-policing, kind of one bucket, two, laws that create tension and interaction between policing, and three, people not being believed when they say things happen. And in response to that, both the city and the state sent additional police to be over-policing, set a curfew to cause more tension, and then did not believe people who said they were being abused by the police. That response was bad. And from the beginning, when I was out there, what I saw was a militarized presence that made no sense for nonviolent protests. That started at the beginning, and what I was told was that was because there was some intel then, which didn't particularly make sense because if that were the case, some of the looting that folks spoke about, calls on fires, if the police were there, maybe that's where they should have been focused on. But instead, what I saw in the first few days were people dedicated to stopping people from blocking traffic. My question was often, why are we doing this? This is probably not the best use of our resources right now, as people are angry and in pain, doing their best to express that. When the curfew was set, it only raised tension. I will tell you, starting from June 2nd, I saw amazing over-policing. In Hell's Kitchen, when I first tweeted out, probably if I wasn't there, it would have been hard for me to believe. Literally, people who were simply holding signs began to get wailed on and arrested. The police were screaming, "Mayor's curfew, Mayor's curfew." The next day at Brooklyn Borough Hall, people were penned in. I was working with some of the white church, doing our best to see if we can de-escalate some of the situation. They were allowing some protesters then to move out one side of the pen. All of a sudden, we saw a rush of police come in. I have that on Twitter, videotaping. You can see that pushing and hitting, really trying to figure out what's going on. I was saying, no one's looting here. Nothing is happening. Why are we pushing the protesters? The next day on the 4th, that was third on the 4th, as we turned from Fulton and Washington, and with my colleague Brad Lander there as well, just an immense force of police. And I literally thought something had happened to a police officer. And we asked what happened. They said, it's time to go home, the mayor's curfew. And all of that aggression was for nothing. There seemed to be no real directive of what police should be doing at that time. And it was sad for a few days. Both the mayor and the governor just were unwilling to listen to what was actually happening on the streets. And I know my time is up, so thank you.
It's great to see you, Public Advocate Williams. My first question to you was, you indicated that the state provided police to New York City. When did that occur, and under whose order was that given?
What I heard, and I can get the date for you, I remember hearing that the state was going to send 4,000 new officers. We would like to confirm if that happened. Between the state and the mayor, they definitely set a curfew. The governor gave directives to enforce that curfew. I remember the governor saying that there's 38,000 police officers, so there should be more on the street. And I don't know if the mayor obliged. I do remember having conversations that perhaps we may want to pull back because it's too tense. The worst day of looting and fires was on Saturday night. I remember that cars went up. On Sunday, actually, things got a little bit better. There were no cars set on fire. There was some looting. It seemed to be a little less than the day before, but it was in high-end areas. And that seemed to be what piqued everyone's attention, because these were high-end stores, and the curfew was put in a day after. I don't believe the curfew did anything besides cause tension. I had witnessed protesters already starting to correct behavior that they themselves did not want to see.
And you indicated you witnessed a militarized presence. What do you mean by that, and where did you witness that presence?
The first day, and I believe I was out there, that would have been the Friday or the Saturday, if I'm not mistaken. They had the police on Barclay, at Barclay Stadium, in riot gear surrounding protesters. There was also the metal pens that were there surrounding them as well. I can't say at that point that they penned everyone in, but it was from the beginning just an oppressive show of force, and we were trying to figure out why that force was there. I even had conversations with the administration about maybe you can stage some of the police if you think they're needed somewhere else and bring them in if they're needed. Starting off that way really just sends a bad message for people who are nonviolently protesting. And I'm not sure if we want to spend all our resources just to prevent people from blocking traffic. When I recall the loss of Eric Garner, who was murdered, one of the reasons I believe we didn't see some of those things we saw in other places is that at that point, people were allowed to express their anger. They went along the West Side Highway. The streets were blocked, but people expressed their anger, which was righteous and just.
So at Barclay Center, they were penning in people, and they were putting individuals in these pens. That's not the same as kettling, correct?
Yes.
And you also talked a little bit about intel. Are you referring to the reports that some of the protesters were Antifa members and/or anarchists? Is that the intel?
I didn't have intel. One of the briefings the mayor gave when asked why there was such a huge show of force from the beginning, they expressed at that press conference that they had intel. They didn't fully go into detail what that intel was. So I have to make assumptions. I mean, there was discussions about other groups and other motives that were either concurrent or different than some of the protesters. But we did obviously see things like looting and cars, and I'm not sure they did a good job with the intel that they had, if that was the reason that they had so many officers there on the first day to begin with.
On June 2nd, a curfew was imposed. And then, as you indicated, the tensions were elevated, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. What I saw in Hell's Kitchen that night was astonishing. Literally, they just came out of nowhere and started hitting these protesters and arresting. There was one person holding a sign, cowering. They broke the sign and were just going off on him. And I literally was asking, what happened? They just were screaming. They literally were screaming, "Mayor's curfew, mayor's curfew."
Did they give warnings to the protesters?
They did not. On those 3 days that I witnessed the worst, I did not hear any prior warnings about curfew. Not in any amplification. I may have heard one or two officers say something, but nothing that a crowd would be able to hear.
Within the last few days, the mayor of the city of New York has issued some reforms. Today, he announced an online database with every officer's disciplinary records. The state legislature, as you know, repealed 50A. They're disbanding the anti-crime unit, and they're going to release body cameras within 30 days. Is that enough?
Absolutely not. And it's always hard to have to say thank you to things that should have been done years ago. So that's always a difficult thing. And it's taken all of these years and 3 weeks of protests and unrest to get the low-hanging fruit, the things that everybody should agree upon, especially this administration that campaigned on this issue. And on the state, these issues have been around for a very long time as well. I was taken aback when I heard the governor say, "You've won, it's time to stop protesting." But what we need to do if we really want to get this to where we need to get it is, as we're focusing on changes in the police departments, which are important, but the real question is figuring out how we reimagine public safety. That's a longer conversation, and where law enforcement plays into public safety. And we keep sending police to do the job of so many agencies that are failing. And so when people say defund the police, I don't get caught up in language. I accept defund, divest, reinvest, but we have to take so money from these departments that have been inflated for so long and put it to other places, because public safety looks different in communities that have access to safe and quality housing, have access to quality education, have access to jobs to put healthy food on the table, access to healthcare and mental health. And those are the discussions that we have to drive. And, I don't always do this, but it seems, at least in the past couple of days, the governor is starting to say the right things and moving forward with his executive order, talking about public safety. My hope is that the mayor will take some of that lead and push the discussions. I shout out to city council, who's actually pushing a lot of conversation on the city level and the state legislature. But my hope is that we really drive home this narrative, that it's not just policing, it's so many other things. Black maternal mortality rate is higher than everyone else because people are not believing their pain. These are things that we have to address and discuss, and for too long, there's been a tremendous resource imbalance in the same communities that are most affected right now.
And my last question, do you know of any specific officers who engaged in any bad acts?
I spent most of my time trying to record and assist the protesters to make sure their voice was heard and to facilitate whatever it is that they were trying to get done. So I did not, besides my recordings on Twitter, did not take down names of any officers.
Thank you, Public Advocate. And now we're going to turn to Attorney General Lynch.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Public Advocate Williams. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for sharing your experiences. But most importantly, thank you for continuing to raise your voice on behalf of the so many New Yorkers who still feel they do not have a voice. In particular, at a time when they took to the streets to raise that voice, only to have it pushed back by NYPD. Thank you again for amplifying their concerns and their needs. We really appreciate it. I wanted to just go over something that I wanted to make sure that I had heard you accurately as well, because you also are in a unique position of having access to many people who are involved in city and police administration. And when you made the excellent point about the amplification of the three main issues of protest, over policing, tension, and sort of the gaslighting that goes on, and you were talking about your work on the streets that night, I thought I heard you say that at one point you were actually talking to some police leaders. You mentioned them as the white shirts, and talking about de-escalation issues and things of that nature. Did I hear that accurately? I just wanted to make sure that I had that information correct.
Yes, all of the nights that I've been out there, that's what I tried to do. Very often I was out there with Councilmember Brad Lander. The 3 nights that we saw the worst things happen, we were there speaking with police and doing our best to facilitate what the protesters wanted to do, as long as they were pushing forward, particularly with a nonviolent message. We wanted to lift that up.
Did you feel that there was any receptivity to your message when you were speaking with police supervisors?
And it's interesting, receptivity and acceptance to change. It was strange. I didn't mention June 1st in Chinatown, where there was actually a young Black woman. She was doing a great job of trying to de-escalate, and we got in. There was some receptivity. We had actually suggested perhaps taking a knee. They didn't want to do that. Sadly, shortly after that is when some of the looting occurred. But the next 3 days, the first night, we didn't even get a chance. They just started railing. The next night at Borough Hall on the 3rd, we actually I don't think I was with the councilman at that time. I was speaking with the white shirts, trying to figure out what's happening. And I guess there was separation between people who were making decisions, because we were talking with one group, and they finally agreed to open up where they had folks either kettled or penned in, surrounded. And they said, okay, we're going to let them out this way. As that was happening, they went down to speak to the officers. The rush came on the other side. And so it was just amazing to watch. And they started pushing. I'm like, what is happening? And people just kept saying, you got to go home. And the next night on the 4th, that was as we turned from Fulton onto Washington, again, we along the way had been discussing and talking to officers, trying our best to facilitate which way protesters were going to go. Out of nowhere, just a rush came in without any notice, nothing. So we had no idea what was going on. Again, when we asked, they simply said it was time to go home. Well, what was interesting also is this were different times of the night while the protests were going on. It seemed as if it was up to, I guess, the individual in charge of the scene to decide what time to enforce the curfew. So there was no real consistency, and it seemed like there was no real direction given of when to enforce what was going on. And then lastly, I'll say, that Saturday before this on Church and Bedford, where they literally just spent 3 hours trying to prevent protesters from going in the street, which was odd to me. I spent 2 hours trying to speak to the commanders that this makes no sense. You're spending 2 hours having your police officers screamed at, yelled at. They have to continue to act professionally irrespective of that. But as human beings, why do that if it's not necessary? And you're getting protesters more riled up. What's the point of keeping folks off the street at this moment in time? That's the least thing we have to worry about. They have very righteous issues they want to bring up. And it just took so many hours and so much effort just to do that. And it just made no sense at all. And these were nonviolent protesters at that moment in time. And of course, there were other things that happened, but perhaps if some of those resources were dedicated there instead of people who were nonviolently protesting, things might have turned out different.
Yes. Well, thank you for those observations. I do think it's important that, particularly for those people in your position who do have access to a level of police supervisory ranks, to have those discussions and to continue to have those discussions. It's troubling to hear that there seems to be a significant lack of coordination or lack of overall planning as well that I'm sure contributed to the scene. And thank you so much. I'm going to have to ask the group to excuse me because I'm going to have to depart for another matter. But again, Public Advocate Williams, thank you so much. Attorney General James, thank you so much. Professor Friedman, I commend you for all your hard work, and I look forward to joining this group in the later hours and then tomorrow to continue this hearing. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Friedman?
Thank you, Attorney General James. Public Advocate, it's good to meet you. I have just a few questions, and I very much appreciated all of that testimony. Were you consulted at all about the curfew in advance of it being imposed?
Absolutely not. I will say I try not to. Let me rephrase that, because I try not to divulge information and discussions I had. There was some discussion. It was not a consultation. It was more of informing that this may happen, I obviously didn't think it was the right thing to do, and I expressed my concern.
Thank you. You've alluded several times to I think it was in Hell's Kitchen, the reaction of the police when it became time in their view to enforce the curfew that they began, you said, wailing on people. Could you just say a bit more about precisely what you saw happen?
I was walking along. Generally, I'll try to walk with the protests, see what's happening, see what they're trying to do, see what I can do to facilitate. This was around 9th Avenue in the 50s, I believe, in the Hell's Kitchen. We were walking. We went past there was a precinct up there, and we passed the precinct, and it was a couple blocks down, and I just saw police start running. This was the tail end of the crowd, so most of the crowd were a little further down. There was a couple of folks, I guess stragglers, for lack of a better word, that were down. They had signs, they were chanting, and they just started going off on them. They literally started going off. Batons, arrests, signs were broken. It was scary to see, actually.
I know that you didn't approve of the curfew, but there are going to be those who feel that if there was a curfew in place, that it should have been respected. And I just wonder if you have a sense of how you feel like the NYPD ought to have responded to the curfew, given the, obviously we had an earlier witness who testified that she was a New Yorker, and so of course they didn't adhere to the curfew. But I just wondered what your wisdom would be about how one might have responded to the curfew other than the way that the NYPD did.
I mean, I have to answer that by starting off saying the leadership around these protests were terrible from the beginning. Both the city and state, but especially the city. It was just bad from the beginning, and that started a spiral of other bad things. And I do want to say, and I want to make sure I make this point, in my conversations either with the mayor, police commissioner, and others, they were generally good, and there was some agreement on things. I don't know what happened in application actually on the ground from the conversations we had. So I just want to make sure I point that out, because I was able to have very good conversations, and I hope to continue in the future. The curfew, all the curfew did, in my opinion, was tell people what time to come out and protest, because they may not have known before. And an act of civil disobedience often means you are going against laws that are not moral, or laws that prevent you from doing something that fights justice, that fights for justice and equity. And that curfew did just that. So I wasn't going to personally encourage people yay or nay. I was just going to make it clear that I was going to be out there to support people who were going to use this as a form of civil disobedience, and really continue to push for the things they were fighting for. And a better response might have been from the mayor to say, I hear what it is that you are saying. This is what I'm going to do to address it. Actually, both the mayor and the governor. Had that been done even earlier, a lot of this might have resolved itself. Majority Leader Lori Cumbo had a great hashtag, which was hashtag Justice Stops Looting. And just to expound on that, had our leaders come and said, let's have a discussion, that might have went a long way. But instead, the response again was more aggressive policing, more tense laws, and not being believed. I am the highest ranking Black elected official in New York City, the second ranking after the mayor. I was also not believed when I would say what was going on. Both the mayor and the governor just fully denied what was happening, even when there's video there, which further illuminates the problems that we have here. And again, what we do with police is actually unfair to the police officers who don't have the tools, oftentimes the direction to fix all the problems they're sent to fix. And of course, the community who needs more than a handcuffs, gun, baton, and summons book.
Yeah, thank you. I've appreciated your testimony. In closing, I just wanted to say, because you mentioned reimagining public safety, we have an initiative at the Policing Project with exactly that name, which is directed at exactly what you were talking about, which is that we as a society send the police to respond to too many issues to which the police are not appropriate. And, you actually won't get disagreement from the police about that either. So I think it's a super important point, and I thank you for raising it, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I really hope we use this moment in time for transformational change. And I just want to remind folks that this came at a time where these same communities saw disproportionate effects of COVID, even though it affected everyone who was mourning. And lastly, that reminding folks that none of us are responsible for the system of privilege we were born into, but all of us are responsible for the system we give to the next generation. So thank you.
Thank you, Public Advocate Williams, for your testimony. I appreciate it.
Thank you, AG James.